history in this building, right? Here we are in the 21st century manifestation of Loyola's commitment to providing information to its students. And we are connected, of course, to the 20th century manifestation of that building to talk about the 19th century version. And I think it's really quite wonderful, and I thank Bob and Fred and Paul who made this available for us to be up here tonight. And to refresh ourselves, maybe we can imagine entering this room on the second floor of St. Ignatius College back in 1878. Now, the college building in which the library is housed and the magnificent Holy Family Church adjacent to it, buildings which we've seen earlier in the semester, formed not only two of the largest structures on the prairie on Roosevelt Ave west of Chicago, but also really, as I think we've come to see, were the heart and soul of the Catholic community around them. As we wander through the library, I think we still, despite the fact that we spent 15 weeks looking at the books on these shelves, I think we still have to marvel at what's been amassed. 9,000 volumes, or 5,200 titles. And I know I don't need to tell you that because you've been doing this for weeks now. But brought together, though, all in the space of less than a decade. The oldest book, as we've discovered, dated back to 1473. The most recent books were published that very year, published in 1878. And the vast majority are 19th century books, right? Books that have been published in the last, say 5 decades before the founding of the college. In its size, the collection of Loyola, of St. Ignatius College, rivaled other Jesuit colleges across the country, many of which had been founded earlier. So, in our little competitive world, St. Ignatius had more books than Boston College, and Boston College had been founded before that. We had some catching up to do, though, with St. Louis University, which had 25,000 volumes, and Georgetown, which had 32,000. But if you think about it, 9,000 is not bad compared to an institution founded in the 1790s that was only at 32,000. Now, if we were in fact in that space in 1878, it was most likely because we were a Jesuit, a St. Ignatius student, or perhaps a visiting dignitary. And I think it's important for us, as we've made our way through the catalog, to think about what the library meant to each. What might it have meant to a Belgian or a German or an Irish Jesuit priest forced into exile far from his homeland by nationalist revolts, just a generation really after the restoration of the order? What would it mean to the sons of Irish immigrants who were attending classes here, whether they were in the liberal arts course or in the sort of slightly more new and innovative commercial course? And what did it mean to people like yourselves, the visiting dignitaries, invited to see the rapid growth and really to see elements of the respectability of Chicago's Catholic community, a community which is, as you can see in this wonderful photo, both patriotic and preserving the heritage of a very old European educational tradition. So our task this semester has been to reconstruct this library on a digital platform so that we can better understand its contents. Now, of course, we were fortunate that the manuscript library catalog from 1878 survived, and it's helped sort of eased our work, sort of. Maybe some of you would want to push back and say it's not been as easy as we would have hoped at times. But within the pages of this catalog, we've seen the impressive contents of this collection, divided into 6 neat divisions: pantology, theology, legislation, philosophy, history, and literature, as well as numerous smaller divisions, chapters, and articles within that. And on top of this, and maybe this is one of the great surprises that we didn't know at the beginning of the semester, is how many of these books are still here, right? I think well over a third of these books can still be found in special collections, in the library storage facility, which some of you have braved, and at least 150 of them in Cudahy main stacks, which is great to think that these books in 1870 are still circulating today and are still informing the minds of Loyola students on a regular basis. Our task, of course, is to share what we've uncovered. So one task was to uncover this material. The other task, and this is near and dear to all of us, is to share this information now, to present to the public what we've uncovered. After hours on WorldCat and in Pegasus, in COA, and as I said, for the most intrepid of researchers, in the windowless stacks of the library storage facility, all of you have come to become experts in a segment of the catalog. Each of you will, of course, represent your knowledge, your newfound knowledge, in the selection of a book for the LUMA exhibit next summer. But today, and tonight really, it's your chance to show off a little of the knowledge you found. And, so the format for tonight is everybody's been asked to choose a book, or to choose the absence of a book, in Katya's case, and to talk a little bit about this book and about the larger story that you think this book has to tell. And I think part of really what's made this such an enjoyable class, and I think this is going to come through very clearly in our talks tonight, is the diversity of interests that you have, right? It's really a pleasure to be able to teach a course with people in 3 different disciplinary backgrounds who come at things you would think in very different ways, but then at the same time, the affinities that you found overlap and reinforce each other in really wonderful ways. So let me just explain a little bit about the format, because maybe I've kept you a little in the dark on how this will work. As you can see from your program, you have been miraculously divided up into panels, which may or may not reflect actual threads within your papers, but so be it. What I want to do is have each panel come up in succession, and you will come up and sit at this lovely table. I'm going to introduce the panel and the speakers just at the very start of the panel, and then I'd ask each of you to come up and give your papers in succession. If I've timed this right, if we've timed this right, there should be 10 or 15 minutes for questions afterwards. And we will just sort of move through that throughout the evening. We'll take a little break between the panels, stretch, take more food. I think maybe I told you were being recorded, maybe I didn't. This is, of course, to help further the project. For those of you, we're all public historians. We all want to get our word out there. So if you're talking into this mic, you will be picked up by the camera. When we have questions or when panels respond, we're going to want to use the handheld mic. So you saw a little bit of this when we filmed the McGuigan talk. But hopefully this will be amenable to all of you. All right, so without further ado, it's 6:15. We're off just by 15 minutes. Let's start with European texts, American audiences. And if I could ask the panelists to come up here. Take a seat. There is a remote here with a laser pointer. I'm not sure if you can crane yourself to get the laser pointer to work. Feel free to. So under European Texts, American Audiences, Part 1, we have Niamh McGuigan talking on Fenelon's Education of a Daughter from 1847. Grace Lerner on a German book that I did not practice, so I won't embarrass myself anymore. and a book that unfortunately changed 3 times over the course of Thanksgiving, owing to survival issues. And Caitlin Pollock on Abelard and Eloise, Essai Historique, 1853. So I will turn it over to you.
All right, hello. So my work for this project involved books classified as aesthetical theology or mysticism. While working through this section of books, I was kind of surprised to discover this book in this section. It's called Education of a Daughter. And it was surprising because this is a book about daughters in what was a school for boys, and also because a book about education, I thought it seemed a little out of place in a section of books about mysticism. Most of the books in this section of the catalog were classified as either works for ecclesiastics and religious, and it includes a lot of guides for praying, guides for reaching spiritual perfection. And the other half of this section included books that are cataloged as miscellaneous theology, and this is a truly miscellaneous section. There's a lot of books about children, guides to religious feasts, books for women, treatises on sin, prayer, mercy, and many other topics. So many of these books center on teaching readers how to live according to religious principles. So in this sense, Education of a Daughter does really fit into this because it's about education in a traditional sense, but it's also about how to raise a daughter so she can be a good Christian and not be a source of evil in the world. But it may also have been included in this section because the author, Francois Fenelon, was largely known for his mystical writings. Fenelon was a French priest who served as a tutor to the grandson of Louis XV, and he wrote many books to sort of aid in this educational project and become really well known for his reputation as an educator. But he also wrote a lot of mystical poetry and things as well. So this helps to understand why this may have been included in the catalog. Fenelon's ideas about religion were very highly regarded in Europe and in the U.S., and many sections of the book are really sort of gender neutral. They could have been applied to a a boy or a girl, and people did read them for sons as well as daughters. But it's also clear, looking at this section of the catalog, that the St. Ignatius collection did include a lot of books that talked about the lives and treatment of women as well as men and boys. So many of the books of this section are written in French, and many of those that are written in English are in fact works in translation, mostly from the French or from Latin. The majority of these books were published in European cities, but a number of them were published by American publishers. 27 books in this section were published in New York, and 20 were published in Baltimore. Outside of those two cities, there are a few in Philadelphia, Boston, St. Louis, but most of them are coming from New York and Baltimore. So in this context, this edition of Education of a Daughter is really very typical. It's a translation of a classic French text that was printed in Baltimore. It's worth taking a quick look at the publication history of this book, because that's where it starts to get really interesting. Education of a Daughter was first published in Paris in 1687, and within 10 years, publication had spread to many other European countries. In 1699, there was an English language translation published in London, and another one in 1707. By the early 19th century, there were dozens of editions in many languages in many countries, including Polish and Armenian, so it had spread pretty far. But many of these editions have significant changes from the original. In editions of the book that are published in England, changes were made to make the books appropriate for a Protestant audience by removing references that were specific to Catholic practices, such as communion and confession and critique of the Calvinist beliefs. So there are a lot of things that just don't exist in these books. One chapter deals explicitly to be altered so that it might be accommodated to the state of religion among us. So there's this sense that everyone who's reading this book recognizes that it really needs to be changed to make it appropriate for the local audience. So Fenelon's work, both his mystic writings and his books for young people, were widely read by American Protestants as well. But it appears that, at least in the case of Education of a Daughter, these audiences probably never saw the original text. They only saw a version of the text that had been revised for a Protestant audience. This is the title page and a section from the first American edition. And in the chapter that gets to sort of specifically religious issues, it's very clear that substantial changes have been made. We're told in a note here at the bottom of chapter 8 that the present original chapter is substituted for that of Fenelon as being more applicable, in the opinion of the translator, to the generality of female readers, at least to those of his own country. So really we're talking about what is in many cases a very different book. The copy of the book in the St. Ignatius College Library was published in Baltimore in 1847 by John Murphy, an Irish Catholic who arrived in the U.S. in 1822. For the first time, we have a U.S. edition that does include these Catholic passages and references, the ones that are frequently excised. The translator isn't named, but I suspect that this is related to an edition that was published in Ireland for a Catholic audience that I haven't been able to track down yet. But unlike other translations, in this case, no mention is the name of the translator's his actual name. We don't know who he is. There's no reference to him. Most other editions make a big deal about the translator's past work and his reputation. But in this case, the only person who's given credit for the work is Fenelon. In the book's preface, the editor explains that the book is intended for parents and teachers, and the book was advertised directly to young women as well. These are probably too small to read, but we have educations for sort of women's schools alongside advertisements for the book. And it was also marketed as an ideal Christmas present for a young woman. So this book really or books like this are kind of evidence of the emergence of a Catholic community where there is concern for the education of young women, and also interest in buying books like this, which were very attractive and pleasing to the eye. The vast majority of American Catholic publishers in the 19th century were Irish, and many of them, they fled Ireland for political reasons, and they brought their knowledge of printing with them to the U.S. In 1847, Baltimore was the center of Catholic publishing, and John Murphy was the major publishing house in Baltimore. I can't quite confirm it until the catalog is completed, but I think there were about 150 John Murphy books in the collection at that time, so a substantial number. The publishing output of John Murphy provides us with a really prime example for investigating the development of Catholic publishing and book culture. In the first 40 years that the press was in operation, The vast majority of the books dealt with Catholic subject matter in some way, but the books covered a lot of different topics. So we have things about spirituality, famous speeches and addresses, commercial publications, school catalogs, and quite a lot of fiction and poetry. Like mainstream Protestant publishers, Catholic publishers in the mid-19th century recognized the growth of women as readers and writers, and they published a lot of books specifically for a female audience. The novels that were published by John Murphy were almost exclusively religious in tone, books that were designed to reinforce Catholic teaching and provide an alternative to popular Protestant or secular novels that were abundant in the marketplace. So in this setting, The Education of a Daughter was published as a new American version of a classic work that had long been had a long history of Protestant appropriation. So it's interesting to note that in the preface for this edition of the book, the editor tells us that this is the first time the book has been presented to an American audience. Now, earlier editions of the work were very common, so the implication is perhaps that this is the first time the true version of this book is presented to an American audience. The emergence of American Catholic books for both religious purposes and leisure reading raised a number of questions. Did the growth of Catholic publishing demonstrate that Catholics were joining the mainstream by engaging in print culture that was similar to what Protestants experienced? Or was it more a marker of difference, a sign that Catholics needed different books from different publishers? It's clear that books from American Catholic publishers were a significant presence in the St. Ignatius College Library, and the completed virtual catalog should provide an opportunity to examine the life of these books in Chicago.
Can everyone hear me right now? Just want to make sure I modulate my voice. Okay. What I'm going to attempt to do here is to make a connection between the German immigrant population in Chicago in the mid-1800s and dialogue concerning the teaching of German language in public and parochial schools. First, a little information about the German population. The population of Chicago grew enormously in the mid-19th century in Chicago. In 1860, nearly one half of Chicago's population were foreign-born and a population of 100,000. Germans were the single largest immigrant group. By 1870, 52,000 residents and 300,000 were born in German states in Germany, including children of German-born parents. This figure reaches 70,000. By 1890, the German and German American population had reached 325,000, and that's 1/3 of the total population in Chicago. And by 1900, 470,000 Chicagoans were born in Germany or had German-born parents. So that's a lot of Germans. Geographically, the German population in Chicago settled originally on the north side. The Lincoln Square neighborhood, if everyone's familiar with it, is a large enclave. The Donkow German American Cultural Center is there and has been there since the 1920s. Another influx settled on the northwest side between Chicago and Fullerton, and North Avenue was known as the German Broadway. And other settlements occurred on the southwest side. So, why do we care? First, let's talk about the German language itself. In the 19th century, German was one of the most important languages of science and scholarship, and scholars and scientists all over the world learned German. It ranked above English and French, especially in the sciences, and of course, with the First World War, it lost its significance. Today, it has disappeared from the realm of international communication, but at the time, it was widely regarded. I had some fun looking at a digitization project by the Newberry Library. It's hosted by the Newberry Library. It has a database of translations of foreign language newspapers. The articles in this project were published between 1855 and 1938, and a number of German language newspapers are digitized, including the Illinois Staatszeitung, and I'll talk about that again in a little bit. I read several articles that address German language instruction in Chicago schools, and some statistics are mentioned. For example, in 1865, 2,597 students were taking German in Chicago schools, and by 1870, that number had increased to 4,553. Several of the articles in this Newberry database, and there were many, indicate that teaching German in public schools was hotly debated. One response to the debate stated that Germans coming to this country forswear their German allegiance, but not their German nationality, customs, or language. German language instruction was frequently one of the first instructional cuts when a debate about school budget was discussed, and German language instruction depended heavily on the German community's ability to mobilize voting in school board elections. St. Ignatius College, I believe, recognized the tension in this debate. In fact, according to Ellen Scarrett, in her book, Born in Chicago, A History of Chicago's Jesuit University, St. Ignatius advertised and attempted to recruit students in Illinois Stadtzeitung, speaking directly to the German population and their concerns regarding language education. They may have also done this in some of the other foreign language newspapers, and I'm still trying to locate that primary source. Which brings me to my section, section 10, which was titled Different Languages, but first I want to tell you about my original journal. The title that I had originally chosen, as Dr. Roberts mentioned, was called Grundzug der Behrensamkeit, which translates to Broad Eloquence. The Pegasus catalog record indicated that this title was in the library storage facility. When I requested the book last week, I was told it was missing, and it has not been seen since 2005. So, that's one of those existential blank spaces in our journey that Katya will tell us about. So Plan B. I chose this title. Here it is in German. I'm not going to attempt to say it. And it means a new and complete critical dictionary of the English and German languages. And this is the physical record, probably very fuzzy, of my section in Pegasus. It was So the record shows author, title, and print, but it doesn't have a publication date for this particular record. So that's why I felt at liberty to choose the 1883 edition. But the original edition was first published in 1864. The edition I have again is 1883, and that's what I decided to go with. This edition in print is Hamburg, Hanka, and Lemkühl. That's this one. And the record in print is Altona. Altona is a suburb of Hamburg, so I decided that was close enough. I am unable to locate any information about the author, Friedrich Wilhelm Thiem. He collaborated on this and other dictionaries with another gentleman scholar named Emil Kreuser and a scholar named Emmanuel Wesley. And as you can see from this list, I had 303 in my section, total of 40 titles for German language texts. So they included German to Latin, German to French, German to Hebrew, German to Greek, German to English, and German to Dutch, and just German. So my hypothesis here is that three things. So St. Ignatius College recognized the tension going on between teaching German in public schools, the huge immigrant population, and that German is the language of scholarly study and science. And so this was a part of their attempt to instruct the humanistic and complete scholar that they were trying to create in their mission and in their school.
I spent the last week flying through airports. Some looked creepier than usual, so bear with me. So,
Don't call it there.
there's a big hole here. So, as I searched through my section of the 1870,
I'm gonna make sure I get you recorded.
okay, thank you.
Thank you, sorry for this. It'll sound good. Thanks a lot.
So, as I searched through my section of the 1878 St. Ignatius College Library catalog, I wondered which title I would choose to write about and display in the future exhibit. which was like really close. I was almost gonna choose that one. But I found myself chosen to this unassuming, blank, plain, red-covered book. I was intrigued by the contents of the book rather than the cover. And I was also interested in the intersectionality of the book. As the title of my presentation implies, I found the book to represent three stories: the intersectionality of medieval French history, late 18th, 19th French history, and late 19th American history. So some background on the actual title itself. The book is the translated letters of Abelard and Eloise from Latin to French. The letters were accompanied with historical essays written by Monsieur and Madame Guizot. The title page gives statement of authority of the translator to a Monsieur O'Doul of the manuscript department of the Bibliothèque Royale, the official royal library. The copy includes two signatures on the verso page that the catalog record remarks as the signatures of the translators, but they're not on the title page, and I had trouble reading what names they were, but what I decided what they were was Squire and Roan, and when I Googled those, nothing really came up with French history, so that part is lost to me. So the actual context of the book, this is Abelard and Eloise. They lived in medieval France during the 12th century, I believe. Abelard was a teacher, a scholartician. He was one of the, he's attributed with being the first person to believe that logic should be part of scientific research and deductive reasoning while doing scientific experiments. He was famed as an academic and as a teacher, and Eloise was his student. And they conducted quite an illicit love affair. And those letters, if you've ever read them, are like naughty. So as you can see, I was really intrigued as why these letters would be included in the Jesuit library collection. According to their history, Abelard got her pregnant. They had a secret marriage because everyone was worried that his career would be damaged by his marriage to her. And he sent her off to a nunnery for the rest of her life. And in her letters, she's very angry that she's been sent to a nunnery. But when asked if she's been married to Abelard, when people start suspecting, she says no. She flat out denies that they ever had a relationship, even though these letters prove otherwise. Although the authenticity of the letters is disputed as well, but that's a completely different presentation. Abelard was castrated by one of her male family members, and he became a monk. So, they're often compared to Romeo and Juliet. Obviously, there's a very obvious comparison. They're seen as star-crossed lovers who just couldn't keep their hands off each other. Not only that, I mean, Eloise is held as an example of what a woman should be. Obedient. She stays in this nunnery for the rest of her life. She's honorable, she's loyal, she never admits to being married to Abelard. And Abelard himself is known for his intelligence. He's very important in Catholic history and in Catholic education. So they both can represent these paradigms of Catholic gender. So these are our authors of the historical essays. On the left is Francois Guizot, and on the right is his wife, Elizabeth Charlotte Pauline Guizot, known as Pauline de Melon. Francois was the education minister and 26th prime minister under the last French king, Louis Philippe. He was known for reviving the, I'm just going to say this in English because I'm not going to try and butcher my French, the Academy of Science, Morals, and Politics, which had been repressed by Napoleon. And he also founded the Historical Society of France. And in fact, now there's a Guizot Award, which is given in excellence of historical research, which is his namesake. I found an earlier edition of this book that was published in 1839, which is when the July monarchy was overthrown in France. And then there's a particular edition that we have in our collection, was published in 1853 by Napoleon III. Guizot was finally exiled when Louis Philippe was overthrown, and he went to London, where he was considered an honored guest of Queen Victoria. His wife, She was a writer in her own right. She wrote children's literature. She wrote on philosophy. I think she was about 14 years his senior. And in fact, according to the Guizot Foundation, which runs the Guizot Award, they met because she was too ill to continue writing several articles that were going to be appearing in serials, and Guizot offered to continue them for her. And that's how they met, and they fell in love. She dies in 1827, and from what I can tell with my rusty French skills, he continued the historical essays after she died, and then they were published. And another note on Pauline, she traveled in the Salon Society of France with very elite intellectuals and thinkers and aristocracy. So she was well known in her own right before marrying Francois Guizot. So this is a section of the 1876-1877 Loyola catalog, like the actual school catalog, not the library catalog. And right here you can see on the right side it says modern languages for the study of French and German. It can be argued that that's what this title represents, a way for the students studying French to practice their French, but there's no copy of these letters that appear in their original Latin. They're only in the French, which is really interesting considering that a classical education in the study of Latin was so important to St. Ignatius College, but they only appear in this Latin in one my section, to the only Abelard and Eloise letters. But I can also argue that given the nature of these letters, they could also have not been read for academic purposes, but also for readers who were enthralled with the romantic adventures of Abelard and Eloise. It was a college, but you could still read books for fun, I'm assuming. So I'm interested how they're able to negotiate the fathers of St. Ignatius, how they're able to negotiate the illicit nature of the letters with their academic use. I feel like the historical essays and who they were written by, as well as Abelard's reputation, were able to negate the romantic nature of the letters. And as I said, Abelard and Eloise were held as paradigms of Catholic gender. And I was looking into this catalog, the 1878 library catalog. The eugenics movement is just beginning in America, and they're targeting Italian and Irish immigrants. And if you want a book that kind of warns you about what happens if you have illicit affairs outside of marriage, this is a really good text for that. And I thought that would be an interesting reason to have the book included in the collection if you're trying to protect your parish from the eugenics movement. So that was one thought I had when I was preparing this presentation. So, Abelard and Eloise, what does it all mean?
Primarily to our first speaker, thank you for introducing me to a book I've never heard of before. Fascinating. Your reference that this book was more professional in nature, perhaps, and teachers and religious teachers might be more appropriate for them than for students. And I'm just wondering if the Jesuit community that ran St. Ignatius College at the time had their own library by themselves in their religious community, or if they mainstreamed the professional books for their own interests in the student library, and indeed it was a library for both students and teachers.
So in reference to the first part of your question about the professional nature, I think the book certainly was addressed to parents, or to, in some editions, it's addressed to governesses. But there is a lot of evidence that it was also read by young people, especially by young women. So it still may have had a role in a catalog for a general readership. I don't know of a sort of a secondary library, but I did notice, this is kind of completely coincidental, while looking at other books from my own section of the catalog, at least one book that was stamped with the St. Ignatius College stamp, but it also said Rectory Library. So I assume that means that there probably was. Maybe you can answer that more completely than I can.
It appears that the books all started in that second floor room in the St. Ignatius building, but over time, different libraries diversified out of that. So there was a Father's Library, which we have a catalog for, and thanks to Katya for sending around the links for that. And then there was a student library that came up in time. Part of what I think one of the projects we're doing this spring is looking at the ownership marks in these books, and I think we're going to see that there's a lot of different collections that are coming and going. I don't know if any of you came across books that had the BVM Sodality stamp on it. So books are coming in from the sisters who are teaching in adjacent schools. So it's quite a rich and complex story. Other questions?
I have a question. I was reading The Great Cat Massacre for one of the other classes that I have, and there's that chapter that's all about like this guy Voltaire's, I think, story. See, you've read this. I was wondering, that made me really believe in your argument or your question about how this was just a fascinating story, this love interest, like, and I wondered if you thought maybe were other people writing a lot about Abelard and how it was and their own takes on this thing, and is this sort of like how popular is this story in general? I thought maybe it's like the actual letters, people had read this novel and now they wanted to know, well, what's the true story?
Right.
You know?
I think that people are definitely intrigued by Abelard in other ways, especially since they're historical figures who are sort of literary figures. I mean, if you're reading Shakespeare this time, then of course you're going to be attracted to Abelard in other ways, especially if you're Catholic. And Shakespeare definitely has a very C.V. slant to his words, but Abelard and Eloise, I mean, if you grew up in a Catholic church, then you can totally relate to them. This idea that there are repercussions for everything you do, but then they continued their love affair in letters anyway, once they both became part of the liturgy of the Catholic Church. I mean, Abelard was castrated and they still continued this love affair through letters. So I definitely think like the romanticism of them are why they've lived so far. And I also think that the French are just very proud of their French history. And Abelard and Eloise play a really important role in that, especially when it comes to deductive reasoning, scientific thinking. And then Eloise is very much, it's argued that you could kind of cast Miss down her role. Well, not really, because she had a secret pregnancy and whatever. But she's very honorable, she's loyal, but she's also strong-headed. I mean, she takes Abelard to task in letters, in private, but in public she was very kind of, stand by my man kind of girl. So, yeah, I agree.
Any other questions? Maybe I could put Grace in the spot. I love the way we've got this sort of French connection here, right, between Caitlin's idea that these sort of French works are being used for pedagogical purposes as well. Your book gives us maybe the dictionary or the code to translating these works, but I don't know if you saw in other sections, either in your section of the catalog or if you'd expect to find in other sections, German language works that you might think would be used in a similar sort of way. Do you assume, you talked a little bit about the sort of professionalism that came with sort of in German language imprints. Was it, maybe, would you look for it in theology or literature or other places?
I would look for it in sciences, just because I really do think that, and I saw this on the internet, so it must be true. The German language, I'm looking at you now. The German language was considered the language of